I just, on the outset, to say when you zoom out, it's actually quite shocking that in 2022 we're only introducing maternity leave for politicians now, and it's only at local level we still need to address senators and TDs. But earlier today, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, commended this country for our progress in facilitating women to advance in employment. But unfortunately, looking around the room, she couldn't say the same about us in terms of our public representation. Women make up less than a quarter of the TDs in the Dáil and less than a quarter of councillors and local authorities across the country. If we want to increase the number of women in politics, then we need to identify the barriers to female participation and work to remove them. The lack of any maternity or paternity provisions for public representatives is one very glaringly obvious barrier. It denies the country of strong female political candidates, many of whom feel unable to progress a career in politics because of structural barriers that are in their way. I welcome this bill and the opportunity to discuss it. As the Minister will be aware, I progressed a private member's bill which sought to bring many of the changes made possible by this legislation. This bill brings some necessary reforms, but it falls short of what is required to make being a public representative more accessible, not only to women, but to people from minority groups and for people with disabilities. This morning at the Disability Matters Committee, we discussed the many barriers blocking disabled people from running for election. These include the extra costs of disability, unavailability of sign language interpreters or facilities. A lack of personal assistance is a huge one, along with inaccessible meeting venues, information and transport, the list goes on. But I think this bill is a wasted opportunity to bring far-reaching reforms in advance of the 2024 elections. The government's own report on reforms for local authority elected members, the Moorhead report, has numerous recommendations which could have been included in this bill. The Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality also has recommendations that could have been incorporated into this bill. In essence, this bill addresses the issue around seeking maternity leave and providing for a person to be temporarily co-opted, and that is so welcome. However, in terms of leave, this bill does less than what I proposed in my bill, and that the government, with the resources available to you, your working group and headline-grabbing pressers, is doing less than what I was able to do speaks volumes, I think, about the level of ambition in relation to the bill. The changes that allow a councillor to avail of maternity leave is obviously very welcome. Currently, under the 2001 Act, a councillor would have to seek permission to go on leave for illness or a good faith reason, which is clearly unacceptable and does not even acknowledge the fact that a councillor may ever seek maternity leave. This bill addresses this and essentially treats the councillor as an employee for the purposes of entitlement to maternity leave. However, your proposal stops there, whereas my bill permitted councillors to apply for leave under the same conditions as local authority staff for maternity, for adoptive leave and parental leave. It's both disappointing and short-sighted that the bill doesn't include a provision for adoptive leave and parental leave. Adoptive leave gives 24 weeks leave off to one parent of the adopting couple or a parent who is adopting alone, while parental leave allows parents to take up to 26 weeks unpaid leave to spend time looking after their children who are under 12. Both of these are standard leaves that are open to workers but not councillors. These types of leave not only recognise the diversity of family life and the issues that may unfortunately arise, they're also gender neutral. This bill does nothing for the partners. Any recognition of the needs of women councillors is great, especially if it facilitates more women entering local politics. However, the bill reinforces the role of women as the primary caregiver, and the types of leave that men can apply for are excluded, and I just don't think it sends out the right message in that sense. Any councillor needing leave for adoption or caring for a seriously ill child will have to seek permission and will not be entitled to the co-opted replacement. This bill is supposed to be about being family friendly and encouraging more people to enter politics, and in that context these are glaring omissions. This is made worse by the fact that I was able to include those provisions in my bill, and for the benefit of anyone watching, my bill was developed by myself and Richard, who's my parliamentary assistant with the Office of Parliamentary Legal Advisors. That's probably less than 10 people, and we're able to come up with more reforms and more wide-ranging than these ones. Minister, I'm asking you to look at that bill and see how you can include measures for adoptive leave and for parental leave. Also, Minister, we know the councillors will be entitled to maternity benefit by virtue of their social protection classification. However, in the case that an individual is solely or primarily employed as a councillor, then will the local authorities be directed to treat them the same as the employees in terms of topping up the payment to match their income? I realise that that is a social protection issue, but it interacts with this bill and it would be useful for the clarification on this matter. The measure in section 2 to enable co-option is very welcome and brings public representation in line with other forms of work where temporary replacements are just a standard practice. However, there are some issues with the suggested process. So in this bill, the councillor has very little say over who will be co-opted in their place. Instead, their political party, if they belong to one, and fellow councillors, in essence, would decide that. And in its pre-legislative scrutiny report, the Housing Committee recommended that the person going on leave has greater control over the decision-making process in selecting their temporary substitute. This may include the ratification of a substitute not being subject to a vote of the full council. They explain that this may create stressful situations for the elected member while on maternity or illness leave, should their temporary substitute be a direct competitor, for example. This is a reality in political party branches that must be acknowledged. Unfortunately, parties often feature in the news for allegations of bullying, and the Minister will be familiar with an example from your party in my constituency around at least one councillor leaving the party because of bullying. In this context, there needs to be greater safeguards to protect the preference of the person seeking leave. We all know the amount of personal energy and time that goes into securing a seat, and anyone elected has the right to have their position respected. Separately, the Housing Committee also points out that the co-option process needs to remain optional, and if a person decides not to avail of it, they should be able to vote remotely. And the pandemic really showed how it's possible to have remote meetings, so that provision shouldn't be an issue to implement at local authority level, although obviously it would be in the Dáil or the Seanad. There are issues that need to be addressed in the bill, and I would encourage the Minister to look at the specifics in the pre-legislative scrutiny report, but also the options for enabling elected members to avail of adoptive and parental leave. The Moorhead report also has recommendations around childcare that could have been included in this bill. The lack of childcare facilities available to councillors is noted in the report. Reference is made to parenting or caring support group being established in local authorities. The group will examine the issues arising in regards to parental caring support and family-friendly measures to be endorsed by the council and draft a council policy accordingly. I'd encourage the Minister to look at how he can introduce regulations around the provision of childcare by local authorities, and Deputy Batchek spoke about how much he appreciated the childcare facilities here. More broadly, there is a need to reform our systems to encourage and enable more women, more disabled people and more people from minority backgrounds to run for election. This bill is too limited in its current form. If the Minister is to rely on other legislation to bring in changes, I think that we all know that that would be years away at this stage, which means the chance to encourage greater diversity in the 2024 local elections will be missed. And realistically, we'll be looking at the 2029 elections, and that's just simply unacceptable. This bill is targeted at local government, but it obviously raises questions about national government. The average percent of women in parliaments in the OECD is 31.6. We are almost 10% under that, and we're even further behind some of our European neighbours. France is almost 40%, and Sweden is almost 50%. TDs are in a situation similar to councillors. Those seeking maternity leave are basically excused for 6 months with no provision for remote participation. And while I recognise there's a private member's bill on the matter, it's something that dovetails with this legislation. Minister Helen McEntee has provided leadership on this issue, but as she begins her second leave, what material difference is there? Is she being accommodated? Yes, but the system itself isn't designed even in the slightest to support her or anybody else in that situation. The Forum on a Family-Friendly and Inclusive Parliament, instigated by the Ceann Comhairle, examined these and related issues. We have a list of recommendations, some of which require government action, such as a referendum to address remote working and proxy voting. We must also look at addressing the long, late and unpredictable sitting weeks. This is in no way conducive to a healthy family life, not only for elected members, but also for Oireachtas staff. And I think just even using this evening's debate as an example, for rural TDs, for example, I won't get home this evening until after midnight, so it feels almost ironic that this piece of legislation would be scheduled for this late slot on a Thursday. We had the same on a disability debate recently, a committee that's predominantly female, and I remember we had the same slot for statements on International Women's Day. The late Thursday evening slot So a lot of elected members won't get home until after midnight. This bill is focused on one thing, and while that is welcome, it raises so many more issues that are not being processed. And while little of this is directly under your responsibility, Minister, and I do recognise that, you're part of a government that has the capacity to bring in many of the identified and necessary changes if you're serious about a more inclusive and family-friendly Dáil. And just finally to say, I remember when I started working on that legislation just after the election for maternity and paternity provisions for elected members, I remember some people saying that I should be focusing more on issues that affect ordinary people and not politicians. And I just want to be really clear about the fact that more women at decision-making tables is absolutely crucial for better decision-making for ordinary people. And you really don't have to look very far to see the fallout from the absence of women at these tables consistently. The key is in the word representative. Over 50% of the population are not adequately represented in our Parliament. We come 97th in the world for the percentage of women in the National Parliament. And to give a really depressing example, there's only one female TD in all of Cork. That's the largest county in the country. It has one woman representing it. So Cork actually has 6 times more Michaels than women representing it. Michaels are quite literally 6 times more represented than women in Cork. We need more women in politics, and another example is that there isn't a single female TD on the Agriculture Committee in 2022. And I think in reality we all know that one of the biggest barriers to more women in politics in Ireland is the selection of candidates, and that comes down to our political parties. The target, I think there was a campaign recently there outside the Dáil, I think it was 50-50 by 2050 or something like that. And I'm a member of the only political party in the country that actually has reached that target and surpassed it. There's more female TDs than the Social Democrats. But I think we have to look at that and just say, why is that? Because it's not like we're entirely sure. Perhaps it's the 2 female leaders as a part of it. But I think crucially, it's because the party's so new. You know, it's 6 years old, and there isn't that with any institution, and it's not pointing fingers at particular political parties or anything like that, but where there is an old institution, there does tend to be an institutional aversion to change. And we see this time and time again when it comes to the elections, and even with the quota, political parties saying, we'll put this person on the ticket to meet the quota, but they're very blatantly there to sweep up the votes in a different part of a constituency for the chosen male candidate who's supposed to get the seat. It needs to change within the parties. So legislative things and gender quotas will help, but until our political parties are more of a welcoming place for women, we won't see the kind of equality and participation that we so desperately need. Thank you.